Today, we are fortunate to have with us L Everett, the author of How Language Began, the Story of Humanity's Greatest Invention. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you very much for having me.
L Everett has a distinction of being Dean of Arts and Sciences at Bentley University and also is a very well-known researcher and author in the field of linguistics. The book title is very intriguing and very fascinating. Sometimes we do have a little bit of mystery around the origin of language. Can you explain to us why is there a mystery and why we are still struggling in understanding how language began?
Well, part of the reason is that there are no fossils of language. By the time we start to see written languages in the archaeological record, language had already been spoken for tens and tens of thousands of years. But to go back to the first creature that ever spoke and find a fossilized word or some other sort of direct evidence is not going to happen. It's just not the kind of evidence that language leaves behind. So we have to look for indirect evidence, both physiologically in the development of our species, in particular our brains, and then also we look at cultural evidence. What were these creatures, whether Homo erectus or Homo neanderthalensis or Homo sapiens, the various species of our genus Homo, which means man, what were they capable of doing? What did they do? And is there any evidence from what they did that they needed to speak to one another? So it's all indirect. It's very difficult. But I do believe, having looked at almost all the evidence that's available, that there's overwhelming support for the idea that Homo erectus invented language as a society, and were the first to use it and to establish human culture.
In the book, you set out to explain not only the origins and the nature of language as well. So the conventional thinking has been, or accepted thinking has been, that the Homo sapiens were the kind of inventor and the developer of language, but your argument is that research suggests that it goes back to the Homo erectus. Generally, they don't get much credit. They are considered as some kind of a species that is not as intelligent as we are.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, they weren't as intelligent as we are, but they were the most intelligent creature that had ever existed on Earth at the time that they appeared, and they survived for 1.5 million years, far longer than our own species has been on the planet. So they were an extremely successful, extremely intelligent species. They were our ancestors. And yes, we may be smarter than them. We are smarter than them. We have a number of advantages, but they're the ones who laid the foundation. And you're right. They have often been looked at as some sort of glorified gorilla, not as strong as an actual African gorilla today, but not much smarter and probably not much more accomplished. I mean, you sometimes get this impression, but in fact, the archaeological record shows that they were creatures of incredible cognitive complexity and ability, and that we really can't explain who they were or what they accomplished without assuming they could speak.
All animals communicate, humans do, but not all animals have language, but we do. Why do we have language that others don't?
That's an excellent question, and you're right that all animals communicate. If we talk about communication as the directed transfer of information, then one could even make the case that plants communicate. But certainly all animals communicate with the directed transfer of information, so that, for example, if a dog barks, they're emitting information directed towards the creature they're barking at, and that carries with it a meaning, information. The difference between that and human communication is subtle but very important, and that is human language is the intentional or directed transfer of information by the use of symbols. And that's the real key. The big difference between humans and all other species is our mastery and invention of symbols. And symbols they sound quite simple. They're a form and a meaning that a society has agreed go together. So, for example, if I say the word dog, D-O-G, that refers to, its meaning is a canine. But to say the same word in Spanish, the same meaning, I would say perro, and in Portuguese, cachorro. In Pirahã, I would say neopai. And all of those are just different forms that go with roughly the same meaning. And those forms and meaning combinations are the agreements of the society that they emerge from. And in that sense, symbols are inventions that are produced by societies, and that's what distinguishes humans from all other creatures. The reason we're able to invent these is because we have brains large enough to develop elaborate cultures that lead to the invention of syllables. And I, of course, spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about the invention of not syllables, but symbols, and how the symbol led directly to all the other aspects of language, such as grammar, that only humans have.
You very well argue in the book that language is not a recent development in human history. It has taken many, many, many generations to get where we are today. And it is also about invention and evolution.
That's right. It's not an either-or story. Our physiological evolution had to reach a certain point before we were capable of inventing a linguistic system. So, the universe, life appeared, according to some, as long ago as 4 billion years ago, but we do know that mammals began to appear a couple of 100 million years ago, and the first evidence for a primate, and of course all humans are primates, is 65 million years ago. And then eventually we start to get hominids that were our direct ancestors, appearing 4 to 6 million years ago. But it's only 1.9 million years ago, 60,000 generations, more or less, that we see the emergence of the first upright human, Homo erectus, roughly 5 feet 11 in average, according to some estimates, and about 150 to 160 pounds for males. Women would have been shorter and lighter. The average brain size of Homo erectus was in the 900 cubic centimeter range, 900 to 950 for males, a bit smaller for females. But there's still a lot of evidence to collect. That 950 cc's, Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, had a brain of roughly 1,400 cc's, and modern humans, males, have a brain of 1,100 to 1,250 cubic centimeters, whereas there are a number of European females who are equally as intelligent as any human male today, whose brains range in size from 900 to 1,000 cubic centimeters, roughly the same size range as Homo erectus. So we know that the size of the brain, while it's important, is not the strongest indicator of intelligence. We need to know how the brain was formed. But in the case of erectus, we start to see things appear that no other creature had anything remotely like.
Their needs for communication was just as primal or primitive or basic as we would call and as our need is, but they were able to take that need and I guess turn into an index and then into icon and then into a symbol and then led to the language evolution as we know today after 60,000 generations.
That's right. So what do we see in the archaeological record? The American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce was known for many original contributions. One of his strongest and most important contributions was the theory of signs, semiotics. In this theory of signs, there were a number of subtypes of signs, but the three basic kinds of signs are indexes, icons, and symbols. Indexes are things which are physically connected to the thing they represent. So if I smell smoke, that is physically connected to fire, and it indicates to me that there is fire in the area. If I see a footprint, I know that was physically caused by something that was in the area. And based on the age of the footprint, I know if that thing is still in the area or not. All creatures, all animals, are not only capable of communication, but all animals are capable of using indexes. no animal could survive if they couldn't use an index. So a lion couldn't hunt without using the indexes of smell and sight to locate its prey. No snake could find its prey if it couldn't use the indexes of vibrations to indicate that to deduce or figure out that there are creatures in the area, and by the size of the vibrations, what kinds of creatures those are. So every animal uses indexes. Those go back as far back as life itself. When we come up to icons are signs that physically resemble what they represent. There's no direct physical connection. So the Mona Lisa presumably physically resembles a woman that Leonardo da Vinci painted some hundreds of years ago. The first icon that we see in the archaeological record is 3 million years old. We find it in a cave in South Africa in the possession of Australopithecus africanus, the direct ancestor, most archaeologists believe, of modern humans, of the entire hominid or Homo line. So they would have been the direct ancestors of Homo erectus. So what do we find? We find in this cave, the Makapansgat cave in South Africa, a stone 2 inches by 3 inches or so that doesn't fit the other stones of the cave. So we know that it was carried there. And the unusual characteristic of this stone is that on one side of it, it looks like a human face. There are 2 eyes and what looks like a smile. I mean, they're not actual eyes, they're just indentations, and an indentation that looks like a smile. It resembles the smiley face on the T-shirts that were so popular years ago, except it's not yellow. It's a reddish pebble or stone, and just about the only plausible explanation for why we find it in the cave, why Australopithecus africanus carried it for miles to this cave, is that it looks like a human. So they recognized it as an icon that bears a physical resemblance. So indexes go back as long as life goes back. Icons we only find in the archaeological record very recently, 3 million years ago. And the only difference then, the jump that has to be made to get from those icons to language is the symbol. And the symbol doesn't bear any physical connection necessarily to the thing it represents. It bears a conventional relation. A group of people decide that they're going to call something. Now, they don't sit down and have a meeting and say, what are we going to call this animal? Somebody exclaims something, and that name eventually starts to catch on with others. And in that sense, the word that comes to designate, say, a saber-toothed tiger or saber-toothed cat is then spreads through the community. And these symbols, once they're created, have to be put in a certain order. I mean, you can say them randomly, but it just helps if you also agree to keep them in a certain order. So maybe you simply agree that the subject, that one comes first. Like if I say that the saber-toothed cat fell down, do I say fall down first and saber-toothed cat second, or do I say saber-toothed cat first and fall down second? It's fairly simple, but if we keep it consistent, it becomes even easier to interpret the symbols. So part of what I do in the book, what I try to do, is explain that although languages grow very complex over time, the essence of language is in fact very simple. It's symbols put in an order. And once you have symbols and you put them in an order that everyone agrees on, you've got language. It may not be the most complicated language on the planet, but it is a language, and it's capable of expressing anything that any other human language can express.
Fascinating. You have also a few other arguments in the book, and they're very well founded, is the conventional or at least accepted thinking is that humans have innate faculty and ability to learn or develop language, whereas what you're saying is that not all languages are alike, and humans don't have the innate ability, but in fact it is handy-maiden to a culture.
That's right. When we look at the physiological evidence, we really don't find any evidence that there's a special language part of the brain. Everybody who learns anything has to store it someplace in their brain. But if you look at where language is found in the brains of most people, it's not the only thing found there. So, for example, there's a spot, a very common spot called Broca's area of the brain that houses language in some sense, or syntax. We also know that that's where we program ourselves for actions that require sequences, such as riding a bike or walking. Language, where it's stored and how it operates in the brain, is at a level that's far more general than innate language would suggest. So not only do we not find evidence for this in the brain, we also find tremendous diversity among the world's languages. Part of the reason for the similarities, there definitely are similarities among the world's languages, but if I'm correct in that the essence of language is symbols put in a certain order, that's not a very difficult solution to come up with for creatures with large brains who need to communicate. For example, we find bows and arrows in most societies of the world, and yet, so far as I know, no one has proposed that bows and arrows are genetically specified. And the reason that we don't need to say that bows and arrows, which are found everywhere, are specified is because we recognize that there's a problem. Protein moves faster than I do, and there's a solution, a bow and arrow, which can move faster than that protein, and which then can bring it down. So it's something that's been discovered and by many, many societies. The bow and arrow is an invention that has occurred many times over in human history. And language could have happened more than one time, but maybe it just happened one time. I mean, it's possible that with Homo erectus speaking, that Homo neanderthalensis learned that it could speak. I mean, there were already creatures speaking when Neanderthals came along, and there were already creatures speaking when sapiens came along, if this is right. So they had a much easier task of it than Homo erectus did. Their brains were bigger and faster. Our brains are bigger and faster than any other creature that, they're certainly faster and better organized than any other creature that's ever lived. The sperm whale has the largest brain that's ever been recorded. That doesn't make them as smart as we are, which again shows that the size of the brain is not the best indication. Most research suggests that the human brain is far more effective than other brains because it has the highest concentration of neurons.
Why do we have languages that are so diverse? And I guess the answer could be lying in the fact that almost all languages have some rather serious connection and roots in the culture. They are byproduct of cultures in most cases.
That's right. Cultures arise with language. So for me, culture and language emerge together. You didn't get a full-blown culture until you had language, but you certainly didn't get a language until you had some culture. So what is a culture? It's a word. This is a word that's used in various ways by anthropologists and others. And for me, I've written another book in 2016 developing a theory of culture called Dark Matter of the Mind. And in that book, I argue that culture, and I use this definition in How Language Began as well, culture is a system of values, knowledge structures, and social roles. Everything else comes out of that. So as soon as so we're not the only creatures that have those, but because you can find, values. Why does a mother bear sacrifice its life fighting a male bear for its cubs? At some level, that can be described as a value. Its life is worth less than the lives of the cubs, whether that's biological programmed or just courage on the part of the mother bear isn't relevant at this point. But you find social roles. So it's well known that wolves and prides of lions have different social roles within the pride, within the pack of wolves. And you find knowledge structures. And humans have the most elaborate knowledge structures, obviously, of any other creature. When I'm doing field research in the Amazon, I'm astounded at the knowledge that the folks I'm working with, especially the Piraha, I'm astounded at the knowledge they have of the flora and fauna in their domain. Not only do they know the names of every plant and animal in the water, on the land, and above the land that exists in their area of the Amazon, but they know about its habits, they know where it stays, they know what it feeds on, they know just about everything. They're always astounded by my incredible ignorance about flora and fauna because it's very important to them. But when you need to name these things and you've got a brain capable of it, words come and they can be invented. And there's a lot of evidence that they were. So when we look at Homo erectus, what did it do? Very often, when people argue that Homo erectus did not have language, they show their simple stone tools, and they say, people who used these tools for a couple of 100,000 years were too stupid to have language. In fact, one of the arguments that is given for the idea that our species, Homo sapiens, invented language only 100,000, 150,000 years ago is that that's when we start to see art. And they have the idea that art is the first evidence of symbols. But this really isn't correct. We find 250,000-year-old stones that have been shaped and colored by erectus to represent females. Those are symbols. Those are at least icons. They're signs. They're icons. And we see Homo erectus villages, such as in the Middle East, that are elaborately arranged with one part of the village for processing plants, one part of the village for processing animal food, another part of the village for sleeping. We see not just stones, but we see wooden spears that were fossilized 500,000 years ago that were used for hunting mastodon. And most astoundingly, we find evidence over 750,000 years old, far longer than, before Neanderthals, far before Homo sapiens, of erectus villages, settlements on islands. And they were islands back then. So the first and best case is the island of Flores in modern-day Indonesia, which for erectus would have been about as far away as Holland from England across the English Channel. And our ancestors, Homo erectus, got to Flores and hunted. And we know that this because we see evidence of their settlements and stone tools. How would they have gotten to Flores? There have been a number of experiments and a lot of research done by archaeologists that strongly conclude that they couldn't have simply floated over there by accident. They had to have planned to go there, and they needed rafts or boats to get there. And how do we know they couldn't have floated over there? Because the currents around Flores are the strongest in the world, now and then. Anybody grabbing, say, to a log floating in the ocean would have been washed away from the island out to sea. There's no way they could have gotten unless they were paddling. Humans simply aren't strong enough swimmers to get across that strait. And not only that, a settlement can't arise unless there are multiple individuals arriving around the same time. And most archaeologists would say that you need 20 to 50 individuals as a founding population. So if we take the lower number, 20 people had to get to Flores around the same time, which means they needed to build rafts. And there have been many experiments. Some archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, have actually built rafts like out of the stone tools that erectus would have had and sailed them across the Flores. And they said the last half a mile or so, they're paddling with all their force because there's no other way they could get across that current. The ocean suddenly gets much deeper and the currents and winds get much stronger. And if you can't paddle, you can't make it to the island. Then we find other islands such as Crete, which Homo erectus got to, again, without land bridges. And a Russian team in 2004 argued that there is strong evidence for Homo erectus settlements on the island of Socotra, which is about 150 miles at sea off of Yemen. And if that's correct, it suggests that not only did they have boats that could take 20 to 40 people across 150 miles of ocean, but they were exploring. I mean, it's possible they were blown off course, but it's also possible that they were exploring to get that far away from land, or a combination of the two. Whatever it is, they survived and they built settlements. So erectus is capable, and the evidence is very clear on this, of tools much more developed than the stone tools they used, the wooden spears and boats. They had organized and well-planned settlements which indicate an ability to communicate far beyond the level of other animals. To build a boat, you not only have to be able to tell others what to do and give instructions, but you have to correct them. And correction and instructions require more than simple communication of the type we find in other species. They require symbols in human language.
And therein lies the evolution and invention that we don't really generally appreciate enough, that how critical the language was in aiding our evolution, because we are one of the few, I guess humans are the only ones capable of transferring knowledge from one generation to the next.
Yeah, that's right. And we can communicate and transmit information across the generations without writing it down. Among the Pitahans and other groups I've worked with in the Amazon, stories that they regularly share with one another, even if they don't say this is a historical story, learn this because it's the history of your people, just telling how they hunt and what they hunted and who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. These communicate the values that transmit the values, social roles, and knowledge structures, the essence of culture from one generation to the next. And humans have this and no other creature does. Humans are the only ones that can tell you something about their grandparents. No other creature can do that. And how is it that we can tell each other about our grandparents? Because we have brains that allow us to plan, to think into the past, to think into the future, to focus on the present. And we see evidence for thinking about the past, present, and future throughout the archaeological record when it comes to Homo erectus.
Fascinating. Tell us a little bit about your field work, which you have done enormous amount of work for almost 3 decades in the Amazon jungles in the Brazil area.
Yeah, it's actually now been 4 decades. It was October of 1977 when I first arrived in Brazil. I went initially to Brazil as a missionary to translate the Bible for people that didn't have the Bible in the Amazon. But within a few years, my interests had changed dramatically I was more interested in the culture and the language. And through my contact with these indigenous groups, I began to realize that my faith, my beliefs, my religion was simply one of many possible answers to the mystery of the world, and probably not even the right one. So I abandoned religion. I still have tremendous respect for many people who are religious, but by and large, I was convinced that this isn't where I want to spend my time. So I spent the next 3 decades working with roughly 20 different groups in the Amazon, but I spent the bulk of my time, almost 7.5 to 8 years of village living with a small group of about 700 people who call themselves, well, they're known as the Pitahans. They actually call themselves the Straight Ones, and they are the greatest source of lessons and ideas and thoughts and reflection in my life on language. They have taught me more about language and culture and surviving and dignity and the meaning of life than I've ever learned from any of the books that I've written or read or other societies that I've been in. They just have given me innumerable, invaluable lessons.
And you survived snakes, and you survived a murder attempt too.
Oh, I have gone through a lot of interesting experiences, from everyone in my family getting malaria, to my son almost dying as a baby of meningitis, to myself getting typhoid fever, to being attacked by large anacondas and poisonous snakes coming up under my bed at night and up the wall right by where my head was. And then outsiders, river traders, Brazilians who were not interested in having me help the Pitahans get better deals for their Brazil nuts. That's the one thing they used to trade with the outside. And so they paid the Pitahans whiskey to try to get them to kill me. And so there was one attempt on our lives, but that's way behind us. And the people were very apologetic later. It's interesting, the Pitahans don't have numbers, not even the number 1. They're the only group so far documented that doesn't have numbers. And this is one of the things that helped me to really understand how culture shapes us more than our genes. So some people have said, well, if they didn't have numbers, how on earth did they trade with these outsiders? And the answer turns out to be fairly simple. You know, if you have a big basket of Brazil nuts, you walk onto this boat that has arrived to trade, you dump them on the deck, and the trader then gives you what he wants to give you. And if you don't like the amount you get, you wait for the next trader. And you say, that trader he only gives me a small pile of stuff. The other trader gives me a large pile of stuff. So it's actually quite possible to trade without numbers, to know all of your children without knowing exactly how many children you have. I'm always amazed at how they get by day to day without the need for numbers, without the need for lots of other things that we have, and yet with knowledges that we do not have. So whereas I sometimes am amazed they get by with numbers, without numbers, or with a language that's quite different from mine, their amazement towards me is equal. They wonder how on earth anybody who has so few skills as I do in the jungle can survive.
In the modern society, I mean, today we know there are 7,000 languages, and most languages are under attack right now. They are not either they're converging, or people are not using them as much as they used to do, or they are struggling with some of the basic structures of the language. How do you see the current phase that we're going through, and what could this lead to?
Well, it's a very worrying thing. Some people have estimated that a language goes extinct every 14 days. When a language dies, we lose with it all the evidence of the structure and nature of that language that could tell us more about the origin of language and the origin of our species. We lose, I've already said, for example, that the Pinahas just have unlimited knowledge of the jungle, and they classify and relate things in their language in ways different than we do. And if that language is lost, all that knowledge of the jungle is lost along with it. The reason languages are lost are multiple. One reason is that people simply die off. A disease comes through and wipes out a whole people, and their language is gone because they're gone. Another reason is economic pressure, and I think this is the strongest reason that languages disappear today. Children want to, they watching television, looking at newspapers, being in the big city. Their standards, their values change, and very often they believe that the only way they can achieve their values is to reject the language of their parents, whose values they may no longer share. And by rejecting that traditional, this is their decision, right? Nobody can make this for them. It just happens. And when it does happen, so I grew up in Southern California on the Mexican border, and I knew a lot of Mexican Americans whose children were embarrassed to speak Spanish with their parents because their parents couldn't speak English well. And of course, the children could speak Spanish, but they were embarrassed that their parents couldn't speak English. But I also know indigenous peoples that I've met, California Native Americans, such as the Borona people that I met many, many years ago when I used to deliver mail out on their reservation in Southern California. And I would ask them, do you guys remember any of your language? And they said, there are a couple of old people who do, but most of us just speak English. And the main reason there was economics. These people, like me, had jobs in the city and wanted to have a better standard of life, and they couldn't go out to the city speaking only their language. They needed to learn English, and so people began to devalue their language and not see the benefits. And we know that people who speak more than one language perform better than people who speak only one language in a range of cognitive abilities and tests. So losing a language, becoming monolingual, a speaker of only one language, is a setback for people, cognitively, culturally, and economically. And it's a setback for the rest of us as well, because when people decide to just speak English, they decide to go to the knowledge structures and the cultural values and the social roles largely of English speakers. And that means all the original ones were lost.
With the language, we also lose the culture, and then we also lose the knowledge.
That's right. The language and culture go together. So there's no way you can maintain your culture without your language. You can remember some parts of it, and you can keep some rituals going, but once you have lost the language, you've also lost a huge part of the culture, and vice versa. Once the culture's gone, there's no way the language can continue on with the same vibrancy and the same range of expressions, and eventually it will die out as well.
We have been speaking with Daniel Everett, the author of How Language Began, the Story of Humanity's Greatest Invention. Fascinating discussion. I'm sure we have a lot more to learn as time goes by, and hopefully we all survived the loss of Latin language and Sanskrit language, and hopefully we will find another language to carry on the culture and the knowledge.
That's right. Hopefully they will. Some languages have been revived, and there are a number of linguists around the world trying to preserve and revive endangered languages.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and please do keep us in mind if you write another book.
I will.